We are back on Midnight in the Desert, the final hour of tonight's very special night, talking about death and dying and how it is not an ending. And right now we're going to try and address probably the biggest problem that a lot of people have when it comes to death, and that being the fear of death. And our guest, Kelvin Chin, is the executive director and founder of the Turning Within Meditation and Overcoming the Fear of Death Foundations. He is an internationally recognized meditation teacher featured in Business Insider, Newsweek, Kaiser Health News, and has taught meditation at West Point and in the U.S. Army, including on the DMZ in Korea. Kelvin is also the author of the best-selling Overcoming the Fear of Death through each of the four main belief systems, a non-religious approach to the four beliefs that underlie all religious and cultural beliefs. He has had many experiences piercing the veil over the past 35 years, and his past life memories reach back 6,000 years. He is a graduate of Dartmouth, Yale, and Boston College Law, has lived in 7 countries, and so far has worked with clients in 41 countries, and he joins us tonight on Midnight in the Desert. Good evening, Kelvin. How are you?
Hey, Tim. Great to be here. Thanks.
It's great to have you, and I think that this is so I started off the program talking about the number one problem that people have with death is that they're afraid of it, and I think that goes back to us just being afraid of things that we don't understand.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's the one that people think if they don't talk about it, we not just kind of ignore it, it'll go away. But or death and taxes, it's going to happen at some point. We just don't know how and when. But yeah, it's something that eats up a lot of people's energy. I think they don't realize.
And it's unwarranted to be so afraid of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's really, well, it depends. So first of all, what I do is I get people to think a little bit more clearly about what they're afraid of, because sometimes when they say they're afraid of death, they really mean that they're afraid of the process of dying. So that's a different fear. So the first thing I do is I try to isolate what their fear is, and then we can figure out the appropriate solution. So sometimes it is actually the fear of death itself. And then I help people figure out more clearly what their fear is about death, about the dying process or death itself. Exactly. So where do they fall in the spectrum of various beliefs about it? And I don't mean religious or cultural beliefs, but I mean kind of general beliefs that we can talk about in the context of our discussion here, Tim.
Well, taking a look at your bio, going to Boston College Law, it doesn't seem like this was the life path that you were originally on.
It's true. Good guess. Yeah, it actually, it's interesting. It's related to law school insofar as my mom died, let's see, my last year of law school, my third year of law school at BC. And very unexpectedly, she was if you met her back then, you would think she was the paragon of health and strength and, very strong constitution, et cetera, et cetera. But she died very quickly. She had very advanced stage of cancer and was 100% asymptomatic, right, just almost to the end. And they caught it, but they caught it very, very, very late. So she died very quickly, and it really shook me to my core. And that's what I got. That's when I first really had to face death in a loved one who was not my grandparents, 90 years old or whatever. It was my mom at 50 years old. That's really what got me going into this whole area.
And in that case, it's death isn't an ending to something. It's a sudden taking away of something. There's no peace in that.
Yeah. So for me, it actually did not start with helping people deal with the fear of death so much as dealing with the grief and grieving around death and dying, because that's what I was, catapulted into due to circumstances there. I was in my late 20s and my third year of law school and so forth, and I was a wreck, bottom line. And, I was working at a law firm downtown Boston part-time and going to school. And if you had seen me in the hallway, Tim, you would not have known, externally anyway, what I was going through. But what happened was I started having conversation with people, and people would say, "Hey, how you doing, Kel?" And I'd say, "I'm okay." And then I dropped into one of the conversations, my mom died recently, and, it's kind of tough. And they just opened up their floodgates opened up, and then their walls came down, and they started telling me about their grandfather or their brother or their sister or somebody who died. And then I started helping people because it helped me to talk about it. That's how I got into it.
So it seems like it came naturally from within you to try and offer this help to other people.
Exactly. But it was really like I back-ended into it. You know that phrase, it just kind of, because I had such a need myself. This is all Monday morning quarterbacking, right? So, and looking back at it, I realize now that I had such a need within myself that I ended up sharing my traumatic experience about my mom's sudden loss of my mom in my life with other people. They start sharing their experiences with me, and I start seeing just kind of what worked in terms of made me feel better, what made them feel better when I talked to them in certain ways, and so forth and so on. So that's how I haven't studied. I'm not a psychotherapist. I don't have a medical background. I have a law background, and I didn't even study any of this in law school. It was just from my human interaction experiences. Is how I've learned about what works and what doesn't work in this whole area.
And what were some of the first things that started to stand out to you from having these discussions with people?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one thing when you're having a discussion with one other person, and it's quite different when there's, two or more other people, when there's 3 or 4 or more people in a group talking about death and dying. Because what I found was that, when it's one-on-one, people tend to be fairly respectful and so forth, about what the other person's experiencing. It's just more intimate when you're talking one-on-one and you're sharing experiences. When you have another person or persons in the group, I think there's this, I remember this from social psychology, studying this when I was an undergrad, but, you have bigger groups, and the level of individual responsibility starts to shrink. It starts to decrease. And people start getting in your face a little bit when, the bigger the group, the bigger the discussion, even about death and dying, even about loss of a loved one. And it started getting into like religious and cultural disagreements. I hesitate to say arguments, but almost. And sometimes it would go there, depending on who the person was. Not my thing, but, you don't know who's going to be invited into the conversation at any particular moment. And so it got me thinking, I thought, we need to talk more about this, but people should not be arguing and saying whose perception about what happens after we die or what happened, all of this, who's right and who's wrong. That's what got me thinking about coming up with a way, and that's where the 4 beliefs kind of came from.
So let's kind of go through those and explain to people what the 4 main belief systems are.
Sure. So that's the genesis of it. How can we talk about this in a way that doesn't step on people's toes? So the 4 beliefs I came up with and they basically underlie and support all of the known religious and cultural beliefs about death and dying in the world. And the first one is a common one that we've all heard before, which is the science belief about death and dying. No mental experience after you physically die. Your mind and your body are connected. Your mind is your brain. And when that shuts off and dies, your mind shuts off. That's the first belief. I call it the science belief. Second belief system that exists in the world, I call it the fear of continued existence. So that's where people believe that there is a continuation of the mind. When I say mind, by the way, just to define terms quickly, when I say mind, it could be soul, spirit, consciousness, awareness. People will use any of those, but I just use mind because I work across so many cultures and countries and so forth. I use words that are fairly neutral. So, but I mean mind like big mind, So second belief system, fear of continued existence. The mind continues, but there's fear associated with that continuation in some way, shape, or form. And then I get into a discussion with an individual, what's their fears about, and so forth and so on. But for this point in our conversation, it's just the fear of continued existence, a fear about something. Third belief system, belief in afterlife, belief that, in other words, the mind continues, but no fear, maybe even looking forward to it. And that's their belief system. Fourth belief system, reincarnation, past lives. So belief that the mind is conscious, aware, can continue and make decisions, and can make even a decision to hang out on the other side or come back in a new body and have a new lifetime, different body, same soul, spirit, consciousness in that body, but different lifetime. So that's the fourth belief systems. And so pretty much that covers everybody, but there's hybrids. So some people are what I call fence sitters, they maybe a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, or they're not sure, like you said at the beginning. It really distills down this whole fear of death. Really, you could distill it down to what you were sort of starting to get at, which is the fear of uncertainty.
Well,
Right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just not certain about what's going to happen.
Well, I was going to say the latter two of the four definitely seem like there is an absence of fear, and almost that people, right, if they have those beliefs, they seem like they're just geared to a basic natural understanding that there's something more, so there's no reason to be afraid. But and obviously the second one is a hard one to deal with too. But I think there's probably a good amount of people that are afraid of the first one, very afraid that there is nothing and that it ends and there's no continuation in any way.
That's the most common person who reaches out to me is the last person you just described. They'll say, so first thing I do with people is because my belief system's irrelevant. I know they may, connect the dots and figure out what my belief system is, or maybe they've seen my YouTube channel or watched videos on my websites or read my book or something and got an idea about what my belief system is. But I don't volunteer that to people typically because it's about them. It's not about me. So I always ask them what their belief system. And if they say what you just said, they'll say, oh, my belief system, I believe in the first belief system, the science belief. My mind, my mind's going to shut off when I die. But I say, okay, well, what are you afraid of then? Because if that's the case, first of all, let's define fear. I define fear with them this way. I say fear is the emotion caused by the anticipation of unhappiness. Okay. If you were like my dad, and this is a true story, so my dad had the scientist belief about death. He would say, stick me in the box, throw the dirt on me, I'm done. That when he died, that was it. My dad's famous line, he would say to anybody, like a zillion times I heard him say that. Well, if you really do believe, like my dad did, the first belief system, then there is no fear. Makes no sense logically because fear is caused by the anticipation of unhappiness. You're not going to have happiness or unhappiness if you have my dad's belief system, the first belief system, because you end when your physical body dies. So my dad was one of those rare people who actually did fully believe the first belief system. He had no fear about dying, about death. Now, if somebody comes to me and frames it the way you just framed it to me, Tim, but I'm afraid of of non-existence afterwards. What I point out to them that they're really a fence sitter. They're really they think they have the first belief system, but they really are a fence sitter between 1 and 2. They really have a fear of continued existence or non-existence is the same thing because they're not sure. And very often people will say this to me. They'll say, but I'm afraid of oblivion afterwards, like being there but not being there, or existing not existing, which doesn't make any logical sense. But that's what a lot of these fears are, irrational. And so I unbundle that for them, and they say, look, you think you have the first belief system. You really are a fence sitter, which is nothing wrong with that. I'd say most people are fence sitters between the first and the second. And so let's deal with it. Let's deal with that, and let's talk about possible solutions to reduce your fears so that you can live more in the present now, which is what my goal of all my nonprofits is to help people live more happily, live their lives more fully in the present, whether they believe in reincarnation or not. We're here now.
And so, what was your beliefs going into starting to study this, and have they changed from the way that you felt then to the way that you feel now?
Interesting. So I didn't study anything. All of my knowledge is from my personal experiences and my rational thinking. So I'm thinking about it and my actual direct personal experiences. So before I had my direct personal experiences, which we'll talk about in a sec, I was in the agnostic. I don't know what category, what happens. And I wasn't sure. And I had no data points, I call them, at that point. I learned to meditate when I was a teenager. And even though that kind of opened me up more to my inner world, so to speak, I still didn't have a sensibility about death, what happens after physical death, until I started having my reincarnation memories, which started happening in my mid-20s. So in the mid-1976, 1977-ish, they started happening, and they've continued to present. And so now my memories, as you mentioned in the intro, go back 6,000 years, 20 to 25 different lifetimes. I've had many, many more than that, I'm sure, but I have memories from about 22, 23 of them or something like that. So that's when my belief system started shifting based on my personal experience in my mid-20s.
And then I think for anybody to make that realization, to realize that they've lived before and that they'll live again, it has to not only be freeing of any kind of fear that may be there, but also it probably makes you think about what it is that you're here in this particular life for. If you've lived so many and you'll live so many more, what can you make special about this particular one?
That's exactly right. And that's the perspective that I take and that I teach, exactly what you just said in your own words. I tell people, what I may remember about a lifetime 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or 200 years ago or, whatever. It's maybe interesting intellectually, and but I tell people it's cocktail party talk. It's you talk to people like you think, that's interesting stuff for a cocktail party. But how does it impact me now today? That's what I encourage people to spend their time focusing on if they ever do have memories like this. Is how does it impact me now? And so I'll give you an example that I talk about in my book, the memory when I was a Carthaginian slave. I was black, very, 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 very dark black, like blue black. You've heard that color, the description of Africans before. That was the color of my skin. And I remember the memory I had was I was dying. I didn't die, but I was dying on a piece of wreckage of a wooden ship. And that was the first memory that I had, and that I was roasting in the sun. I remember the pain, and it was a very visceral, very physical, very, tactile, tangible experience. A lot of senses were going on, physical senses were going on in that memory. So it wasn't just a vision kind of thing. And then it expanded over time. It expanded into other memories from that particular lifetime that like what happened, I don't know, hours or days before, whatever. And we're rowing. I was a slave. I was rowing in a ship, and we were fighting the Romans. And so I had to look this up. So then I tell people, follow the breadcrumbs. I have this phrase, follow the breadcrumbs. So I followed the breadcrumbs in my own experience, and I looked up who was fighting the Romans. And at first I thought I was on the ocean, but then I realized I was on the Mediterranean, but you couldn't see land, so it was just a huge body of water. And I looked it up, and I remembered certain aspects of the ship and so forth, and I looked those aspects up of the physical structure, and I figured out I was in the Punic Wars. It was about 330 BC, about 2,300 years ago. And I survived, obviously. Now, to your point, here's what I took from that experience. I took from that experience and applied it today in Kelvin Chin's life, the willpower that my mind had to almost force myself to stay alive, because I was being roasted in the sun. I had no water, I had no food. And I don't know how many days, I was delirious when some, fisherman or somebody picked me up. And but the willpower is what I remember. That's the dominant memory, the emotional memory, the dominant emotional memory from that experience is the willpower I had to will myself mentally to stay alive. And that's fed me, and that's helped me this lifetime when I've gotten laid off 5 times since I was 50 years old. Very difficult. age discrimination is an ugly reality in our culture that you'll never hear about because you can't really sue because you can't prove that they threw your resume away when they see all the experience that I had. So, that nevertheless, each time you have 50, I pull myself into the saddle again, get another job, support my family. But that experience 2,300 years ago is what informed me today.
Well, yeah, age discrimination is a really bad problem, but imagine if they really knew that you were 6,000 years old. Then they'd really...
Exactly. Looking pretty good for 6,000. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you hold up well. So how did these memories start coming to you? How did you start remembering these past lives?
Yeah, it's interesting. So they've come in all different different forms, but also at different times in my life. So, for example, sometimes lying down, resting after I meditate, sometimes during my meditation, sometimes in the shower. Now it's gotten so I'm so comfortable with it. It can come in my in the shower. But at first, it was mostly when I was in a kind of very quiet state or dreaming. And in some cases, I've had lucid dreamings, very, very crystal clear dreams, real life kind of experiences where I had very emotional content, a very strong intense emotional content in that dream. That's how the very, very first one came about for me. Very often in these experiences, at least from my experience anyway, there's strong emotional content that goes along with the initial foray into that particular lifetime has a strong emotional intensity to it.
And I guess the question has to be asked, how do you know then that it's a legitimate past life that you are envisioning and not just something that's in your imagination?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a good question. It's a totally legitimate question. And it's a question, quite frankly, I asked myself very early on. Many times I had that conversation internally in my head. I was like, watch too many sci-fi movies? What's going on here? But I think the bottom line is there's no real absolute objective way to know. But there are ways to externally corroborate somewhat, I would say. I think that, people who profess that, we have scientific proof that blah, 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 I think that's a waste of time, quite frankly. I think what's more important is, does it make sense to you? Now, and I'll give you some of my corroborating experience in this sense, but let me answer this part of the question first. I think what's most important is, does it make sense to you? And if it does make sense to you, and you do seem to interpret your experience that way, how does it inform you about you today? Because to me, whether it's meditation, whether it's past life memories, whether it's whatever, whether it's just me living my life in waking state with relationships that I have with various people, including you, Tim, to me is how does everything in my life inform me more about who I am? It's this self-realization. It's the self-knowing. It's the know thyself thing. And to me, that's what self-development is all about. So I suggest that that I use my own memories in that same way, as I said earlier. But how do you know? Well, some data points, I'll give you some corroborating things that have happened to me over the last 40-something years that this started. The very first memory I had that I just briefly told you about that happened to me in a lucid dream, I was very upset. I was really distraught. And I was lying in a ditch. And I was it was the most emotionally upset I've ever been that I can ever remember being. This lifetime, any lifetime. And I was lying in a ditch. I was extremely upset, emotionally distraught.
You know what, Kelvin? We're up against a break, so we're going to take a break right there. This is what we call in radio a cliffhanger. a tease to get you to come back to after the break. But we'll pick it up right after the break on the other side as we are discussing overcoming the fear of death with our guest, Kelvin Chin. And if you want to find out more about him during the break, if you go to midnightinthedesert.com, click on his bio right there, you'll see the relevant links over to his websites, overcomingthefearofdeath.org, kelvinchin.org, and turningwithin.org, and also how you can pick up his book, Overcoming the Fear of Death, through each of the 4 main belief systems. So again, if you want to pick up the book, you can do so right at midnightinthedesert.com. It always helps us out if you want to pick up our guest's book or books, if you do that by going to our website and doing it through our affiliate links so that it helps support the show. We'll be back with more Midnight in the Desert coming up in just a few moments. And welcome back into Midnight in the Desert, our final segment of the night, talking with our guest, Kelvin Chin, about overcoming the fear of death.
Hey, Tim. So, let me just interject something quickly before I continue with that first past life memory that I had.
Sure.
And that's that when I talk about reincarnation with people publicly, I always say, first of all, everybody's got to realize we've all been famous people, we've all been slaves, and we've all been warriors, and we've all killed and been killed in all our lifetimes. Because if, in fact, reincarnation does exist, we've been around, many of us have been around tens of thousands of times, lifetimes, over the hundreds of thousands of years, and then maybe millions of years. I don't know how many, you keep changing, the archaeologists and the anthropologists keep changing how long humans have been on planet Earth. But it's been a long time. And in all of those cultures, even before written history, there were famous people in the villages, in the regions, and so forth and so on. They may not be written historically because there wasn't writing at the time, but they were famous. And so we've all been famous. We've all been slaves because of slavery just being such an endemic thing throughout human civilization. And wars have all existed. So people have been killers and been killed, warriors and victims in all our lifetimes, I think. So that just as a kind of set the stage perspective. So back to the experience I had in this lucid dream. I was lying in a ditch. I was distraught. I was really upset. And I knew it was from a long time ago, just from looking at my clothes that were tattered and so forth. And I couldn't see my face, but I could see down my legs and my feet. And then later in this memory came my sandals, and I could see the sandals and so forth. So I knew that this was a long time ago. I didn't have laced up sneakers or shoes or whatever. Fast forward about 6 or 8 months, I was talking to my friend George Hammond on a long meditation course. You mentioned that I've been teaching meditation for 47 years now, and back then we go in these long meditation courses sometimes with certain TM teachers. I started out for 10 years. I taught with the TM, Transcendental Meditation Organization Movement. I taught for Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's organization for 10 years and met with him. I was an international leader in his organization and so forth, met with him many times. On one of these courses, we would meditate pretty much all day, every day, and we go for walks. So I was off on a walk with my friend George, just get a little exercise in between our meditations, basically. And I started to tell him this dream experience that I had. This goes to your question about how do you know it's imagination or any external corroboration or whatever. And I started to tell him that I was really upset in this dream. Now, in this meditation group, in this hotel, we would have been meditating in group meditations and getting Kundalini rushes, doing these certain kinds of meditation techniques that we were taught at the time. And at one point, everybody else is kind of getting Kundalini rushes, and they're kind of bouncing around on the foam mattresses that we're sitting on in this hotel ballroom. And at one point, I started flipping over on my back, and I was getting crucified upside down. And so that went on for weeks. And so George and I are walking up in the pasture and outside the Switzerland Hotel, and I started telling him about this dream I'd had 8 months earlier, and he finished the dream for me. All I told him was I had this dream. I was really upset. And he said, yeah, you were lying in the ditch on the side of the road, and you had sand with dirt and all over your hair and your blah, 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 your clothes and everything. You were just, and you'd been crying all night. I said, how did you know that? He said, because I found you. I found you 2,000 years ago. I was the one who found you. So he was my brother Andrew in that lifetime. So he found me, and that's when he said, you've been flipping over on your back, getting crucified upside down for the last 2 weeks. Every time we have a group meditation, who that was. And so I grew up Protestant, but I did not pay attention in Sunday school. So I have no recollection of biblical stories or anything. And so he was a, Catholic altar boy, paid attention and so forth, told me who had been crucified upside down. So that was my first memory. And then much later, I had a memory. Then I had my Carthaginian memory that I told you about, being a slave, et cetera, et cetera. I had another memory being a crusader. And in that memory, I'm just giving you a couple of highlights
Sure.
to answer your question about the imagination versus how can you corroborate these things. So I had a memory of, and this one happened, to answer your question, the earlier question about when can they happen? This one happened, I was just lying down resting. I was not meditating. I was not sleeping. I was not dreaming. I was not wide awake. I was in that in-between state, just lying down. And this one happened, and the TV screen went on in my mind. And then I saw myself, I didn't see myself yet, but I saw a room. I was walking into a room, and it was a stone room, big, huge stone blocks, 2-3 foot blocks of stone, floor, wall, ceiling, 40-foot high ceiling maybe. And I walked in, and nobody in the room, empty, no people, all the furniture pushed against the walls except one piece of furniture in the middle of the room was a full-length mirror. I walked up to the full-length mirror, and I saw myself, and I was Caucasian. I was huge. I knew I was big. I didn't know how big I was at that point in the experience. I had full-length, red hair, reddish blondish hair, long hair, reddish blondish beard, and full-length chainmail, white tunic with a cross on it. I was a crusader. And then I had an energy rush went through me with just knowing that was me, and that I was looking at myself. And much later, some decades later, in other words, this is an example of how these things, they don't just come linearly all at once. They come in pieces over decades. Mine have come anyway, over decades. Some decades later, I knew I was 6'5", 225, 230 pounds in that lifetime. 6'5" crusader in the Third Crusades. And so there weren't too many people that big at that time, never mind in the Third Crusade. So that data point came up. And then another probably 30 years after my initial experience of seeing myself as a crusader, about 30 years later, I was in meditation, and I was having a vision of being on horseback with dust in my teeth and rocks and just dust everywhere. And I was in battle on horseback with a broadsword, fighting, obviously, and I was yelling Saracens. And I didn't know what the word Saracens meant in Kelvin Chin this lifetime. So I had to go look it up. And I found out that the word Muslim is a relatively new word in our lexicon. We started calling people who, follow Muhammad and Islam and so forth, we called them Muslims around 1300 AD. That's a relatively new term, about 700 years old. Before that, they were called Saracens. So my lifetime in the Third Crusades was in 1100 AD. That's when we called them Saracens. I didn't know what Saracens was. I didn't know if it was a noun, a verb, an adjective, what it was. And I looked it up, and that connected to that lifetime.
Well, that sounds corroboration to me.
Right? So that's an external corroboration. Here's another one. This one was remarkable to me, and I just found this out. It's interesting we're having the interview right now because this is the first time I'm publicly saying this. because I just found this out about 10 days ago. So the memory I have with a knowingness, it wasn't even a memory at first. So sometimes these can come in visions, and other times it's just a knowingness. So I knew around 1979, early 1980s, I didn't know exactly when. I didn't journal this stuff because I never thought I'd be talking about it. I talked with a few close friends about it. We thought, no big deal. We're not going to be talking about this publicly. So we never thought much about it. But somewhere around the early 80s, late 1970s, I had this knowingness that I had been a king of Prussia. So I'd been a slave, I'd been a woman, I've been a this, I've been a black slave, I've been this, all this different stuff. And here's a random one. Knowingness, I was a king of Prussia. I didn't know where Prussia was. I knew it was someplace in Europe. I didn't know when it was. I never even bothered to look it up because all I had was that. I didn't have any other memory. I didn't even have a memory with it, just a knowingness. Fast forward, I start having other memories. And I started reading about, I started having memories of Rome. Now we're fast forward to the 1990s, being in Rome, in ancient Rome, and an affinity with this. And then I remembered being a Roman emperor. I remember being Marcus Aurelius. And I started having all these memories of this lifetime. I get a biography of Marcus Aurelius, and I look, and in the back of the biography, it's a 2-inch thick biography, there's a chapter, and he talks about the historian is talking about people through history who revered Marcus Aurelius. And he talks about this person and that person, and in the 18th century, a king of Prussia modeled his life after Marcus Aurelius. And the king of Prussia is Frederick II. And then I thought, well, that's weird, So then I started looking up Frederick II. This is the follow the breadcrumbs suggestion that I give people. I look up Frederick II, and what do I find out? I found out that Frederick II bought a beautiful, expensive statue of a relatively unknown Roman emperor named Antoninus Pius and placed it prominently in Frederick's garden in his palace at Sanssouci. That's the name of the palace. And this relatively unknown Roman emperor, Antoninus Pius, it was just like thrown into some history book somewhere I read. And turns out that was Marcus Aurelius' stepfather. He was the emperor who preceded Marcus Aurelius and who succeeded Hadrian, because Marcus Aurelius was too young to become emperor. So Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius in between and said to Antoninus Pius, you need to adopt Marcus Aurelius so he'll become emperor after you when he becomes old enough. How random is that?
But I would also have to think that when you start having these corroborations for these memories that you're recalling, it must have started to make you think that, there might have been other things that came to you before you even knew what was happening. So was this, did you go back and realize that this had been something that you had been experiencing prior to knowing about past lives?
Yes. It's interesting you say that. But let me answer that question first, but I'll give you one other, the point of corroboration that came up 10 days ago. All right. So I'm going to finish the Frederick and the story with you. So 10 days ago, I'm talking to this guy who I just had met on Facebook, basically. He said that we met several years ago at an event, but I don't remember that because there were so many people there that I was speaking at. But we met on Facebook a few months ago. We started communicating more closely. He tells me about a story. So he's a former TM teacher, also Transcendental Meditation teacher from the 1970s. He said in 1973, he was told, and there was a whole bunch of people who were in a lecture, that the first person that Maharishi taught in the West to meditate, a guy named Charlie Lutz, who was maybe 50 years old when I was 20 years old back then. And Charlie Lutz was giving lectures saying that there was a TM teacher among them at the time who had been Peter and Frederick the Great, Frederick II, in previous lifetimes, and it was the same soul, and that he was in the TM organization at the time. And so this guy who's telling me this, William Baldridge, is telling me this 10 days ago, has always assumed that I had told Charlie. That was 4 years before I had my first past life memories. Charlie Lutz was telling people that I existed and that I was a TM teacher in the TM movement. That was 4 years before 1977 when I had my first past life memories. That's the most external corroborative experience in these memories that I can point to. As Widge has always thought, William Baldridge, his nickname Widge, has always thought that I told Charlie. I said, I didn't even know Charlie. I never been to his lectures. I never talked to him. I never read any of his lectures. I didn't know who he was. I knew who he was, but I never been in his presence. So back to there you go. So that blew my mind. That was just 10 days ago, Tim. So back to your question about, stuff that I've had before I had my past life memories. The short answer is yes. I call them recognition memories. So when I was 5 and 6 years old, my mom, when I told you I grew up in Norwood, Massachusetts, not far from where you are, and my mom, we would go into the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston on Huntington Ave there, right? And my mom and I would go in on Saturday mornings. This was long before going to museums was like the cool thing to do. We would go there, and there were very few people. We go there when it opened at 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning. My mom would go in, and she'd say, "Kel, look at Mickey Mouse watch. Look at Mickey's hand. His small hand on Mickey's arm is on the 11, and his big hand is on his long arm is on the 12. I'll meet you back here." So 2 hours I'd roam around, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We would go in there every couple months, sometimes once a month. And just my mom would go off and look at whatever. And I would go to 2 areas primarily. I would go to the Egyptian mummies and the medieval armor. The Egyptian mummies, 3,500-year-old bags of dust. And I'd feel like I was at home. So I have several lifetimes as an Egyptian priest 4,000 years ago.
But now having all of this corroboration and knowing all of these things about your own past lives, I mean, obviously that makes it easy for you to accept what's going to happen next, but it won't translate for everybody else that you're trying to help. I mean, how do you try and help people reduce their fears of dying if they're coming at you from one of these different beliefs? Right.
So it depends on where they're at in the belief system. So I talk to them through that lens. That's number one. I always talk to them through their lens, not my lens. My lens is irrelevant. And sometimes they'll get curious and they'll ask me, and I reluctantly will tell them about some of the experiences that I've had, so forth. But I really want to stay focused on them. And so I look at it through their lens, their belief system lens. And then if they seemed curious about the other side, then they'll ask me and we'll talk about it. And I'll talk about my experiences on the other side. And I'll say, look, these are my experiences and they're not your experiences, but since you asked, we can talk about it, So that's one prong of my 2-prong approach is what we just described there. And I call that the understanding prong of the approach. So we can talk about it. It's content oriented. It's helping clarify things. It's sharing data points with people and so forth. But it's not their experience, right? So the other prong of the approach is experiential, is to give them experience of what? I'm not going to give them experience of death and dying. I'm not going to necessarily give them an experience of the other side. But what I am going to do is give them an experience of themselves and the fact that their mind and their body are not the same. And how do I do that? So I do that through teaching them my turning within meditation technique. I call it turning within now. I've made it easier. I've moved all the cultural trappings from it and so forth and made the technique much easier than what I used to teach in the 70s. So I teach them that. And what does that do? It does a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, it lowers their cortisol, all their stress hormones, their cortisol levels, their lactic acid, and whatever other stress hormones you want to talk about that are too much stored up in their muscle tissue and their brain tissue, causing them the anxiety, that reduces. So that balances out. then they have fewer triggers that are going on from a neurochemical standpoint that's going to trigger their anxieties. Okay? So, and then what does that do also? They sleep better. Well, they sleep better, they're going to feel less anxious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it has this cascading positive effect neurophysiologically. Mentally, so basically what I tell people is I teach people how to turn on the opposite of the fight or flight switch. That's what it does. So the other element that it's doing is it's expanding the conscious capacity for mental experience. What does that mean? That means that it's allowing the person's mind to get out of what this psychology professor, I borrowed his analogy from the 1970s. He used to talk about the people incorrectly think their mind is this limited to this little 8-inch plastic bucket with 10, 15 ping pong balls bouncing in and out. That's their thoughts, their ping pong balls. And they think their mind is this little limited thing. They say, no, your mind is vast. It's huge. It's like the biggest football stadium you could ever think of, but it's not lit up. And whether you want to think of the mind as the brain or you want to think of the mind as consciousness, it works either way, his analogy. Because if you can wake up more of your brain cells or wake up more of your consciousness, then it's like turning the light switches on. And that's what I teach people to do. That's what the technique that I teach automatically does. It turns on more of the light switches. What does that do? That expands the conscious capacity for the person's experience. They feel stronger and more self-confident inside. They feel more powerful within themselves. Their fears dissipate because they feel like I can handle uncertainty. I can deal with whatever because I feel so self-confident now. They get an attitude like, kids, bring it on. I can handle it. It's like whatever. Because I tell people I cannot get rid of uncertainty. Uncertainty is part of the fabric of our universe, the free will universe that we live in. But I can help you get rid of your fear. That's what I can do.
And if you get rid of that fear of their own dying, I'm sure that helps them with the grieving process if they lose loved ones around them.
Exactly. It can help with that. Now, the grief and the grieving process is slightly different because there's conflicting feelings that often come around with the loss of whatever. If it's a loved one or a loss of finances, I help people with any kind of loss in the grieving process. So the conflicting feelings that go along with that, like my mom would say, don't come visit me in the hospital. You should be studying. I was in law school. Don't waste your time. I'm dying. Why? And like, what do I listen to her? Do I not listen to her? I want to see my mother. I'm close to my mother. So I have all these conflicting feelings after she dies, right? That tremendous burden on me from a grieving standpoint, not only just being overwhelmingly sad for having lost her, but conflicting feelings. Should I have not listened to her? Should I have gone more often to the hospital? Blah, blah, blah. It was in Walpole, which where that is in Massachusetts. It wasn't far away from BC law school where I was. So, but, should I have gone more? All the conflicting feelings. That also is what I help people deal with. And yes, the death and dying, as you say, fears and getting rid of that can help minimize the grieving, but the grieving is also separate.
So I think, in just the final couple of moments that we have here, the important thing for people to realize is that, there is no finality in this, no matter which belief you might be going in with this, you've proven to yourself and hopefully to our audience that there is something beyond, that there is something more, and that there is nothing to fear. And hopefully that will resonate with our audience. But if not, they can reach out to you and they can find out more about how to work with you, both on turning within and overcoming the fear of death.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I've had many communications with the other side, started happening in 1986. So that goes way back too. So all of that indicates to me that we continue. But again, if I work with each individual through their lens, it's not about me convincing them. I do not take that approach. It's about me giving them potential data points, but fundamentally teaching them to meditate in order to reduce their fears about anything.
Is there, I'm sure it changes with each person and how long it's going to take for them to go through this process. But would you say that, people will start to feel some relief of those fears as soon as they start looking into this?
Yeah. The people typically, it varies from individual to individual, as you say, but typically within a matter of weeks, for sure. And then months, it's like, in some cases, months, it'll go away. In one case, Jeremy Taylor is on my website, did a short video even. For him, within 3 years, his fears are completely gone. So it dissipated over that time, and he felt better and better and better. But eventually, he didn't even realize how long it had been since he had not thought about death and dying.
Well, Kelvin, I think we only scratched the surface here of some things that we could talk about more in the future. Hopefully you'll come back with us and we can get really, really in depth with some of these topics.
Sure. Anytime, Tim.
That would be fantastic. And everybody out there, again, if you want to check out Kelvin's work, you can go to overcomingthefearofdeath.org, kelvinchin.org, turningwithin.org, all linked up at midnightinthedesert.com, as is the link to get his book, Overcoming the Fear of Death, through each of the 4 main belief systems. Hopefully tonight has helped any of you out there who are afraid of death, who have had loved ones who have passed away, and you're worried about where it is that they may be. You're worried about the finality of it all. Hopefully this has helped you with some of that, and that's what we try to do here on Midnight in the Desert. We try and give you good, thought-provoking topics to take into your own life, but we also try and give you a little bit of help and assistance now and then where we can. Thank you all for a great night of discussion. Until next time, for Keith, for Michelle, for Tracy, and everybody in the Midnight Society through the high desert via the spooky South Coast, I'm Tim. Have a good night.
Will we make it till tomorrow? Will the sun shine on you? Midnight in the desert, and we're listening. Ooh, we're listening.